Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about Discworld. Yes, I know I've promised you Wheel of Time, but I was sick all day yesterday and didn't actually get to do videos. Yes, I started reading Winter's Heart, and then I forgot all about the stuff that I read, because brain dead and head dead and so forth. So instead, what I'll do today is Interesting Times, book 17 in publication order, so we can slowly creep up to where we are right now, which is exactly here with Interesting Times in our Discworld read-along. If you want to join us, join the Unabridged Discord, Unabridged Burners Discord server. I'll link it down below. We'll have our next one next week on Sunday, the 27th of March, about book 18, Masquerade. It's a witch's book, so have fun with that one. It's not that long, so you still have time to read it. Well, yeah, without further ado, let's go and start talking about Interesting Times, shall we? Ooh. Cheers. Alright, so let's find out what's wrong and what's right with Interesting Times. I'll give you a quick synopsis again, and then you can go and read it, and then you can watch the rest if you feel like it. So this is a Rincewind book. It's the 5th Rincewind book, I guess. Maybe, I'm not quite sure. I'm not good with counting, I guess. Yeah, it's the 5th Rincewind book, right? It takes place in the Agatean Empire, also known as the Aurient, because of, as a joke, obviously. It features Rincewind, it features Cohen the Barbarian, and it is all about Rincewind having to come over to the Agatean Empire to reunite with Twoflower at some point, and to get involved in political machinations in that place. There's other bits and pieces, but that's the main plot line. So yeah, it's not the best Discworld novel out there. It's one of my least favorite ones, but I'll try to explain what's worthwhile about reading it and what's maybe problematic, but still worth reading to acknowledge those problems, right? Alright, now that you have read the book, let's talk about the bits and pieces and why it doesn't work so well and feels kind of weird. Now, there's basically two plot lines, which is the Rincewind plot line and the Silver Horde plot line. We have some flashes in between with Lord Hong as the weird bad guy, villain, who's a bit over the top. I guess we can see why that is the case in a bit. I mean, he feels like a caricature of your typical Sax Rohmer-esque Fu Manchu kind of guy. Now, the problem with that, obviously, is that Fu Manchu is already a pretty racist character. And we'll have to talk about racism and negative stereotypes about Asian people. By Asian people, I mean mostly Chinese, Japanese people in this regard. A lot more during this book. It was published in 1994, and I think that's what will be interesting for the overarching story, because the overarching theme of this book, I guess, is the ongoing debate between individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other hand, as sort of the big conflict in society. And Terry Pratchett chooses this specific story to make his points on that. There's a bunch of problems with that we'll get into in a second. Now, why is this important to understand? This book was, as I said, published in 1994. The famous Francis Fukuyama book about the end of history was published in 1992, although there's some older essays in there, of course. This is shortly after the downfall of communism as we've known it in Russia. The Soviet Union broke apart at the end of the 80s, early 90s. I feel that this is largely is one of the reasons why this book is the way it is. Because the overarching argument that this book makes is that the idea of collectivism in the way that it is portrayed here by the so-called Red Army, or before that probably by the system of feudalism, the way it is portrayed here as the empire under the emperor, the lords and whatnot, is wrong, dangerous and harmful, while individualism may still be kind of harmful, but at least it's all about people taking responsibility for their own actions, and that is portrayed as good. Now, obviously, Terry Pratchett has always been an author who is something of a libertarian, I guess, something of a very libertarian kind of thing, person. The way you read Ankh-Morpork, the way Ankh-Morpork is described is oftentimes about, capitalist, individualist, entrepreneurship, and so forth. Now, there are obviously, he's not like completely uncritical of these things, but it's certainly something that he seems to favor. And the Agatean Empire, as it is portrayed as existing, is very much a cliche of Orientalism. Which is, oftentimes described as the Oriental character and the Oriental culture as despotic rule, and that is otherwise accepted or needed by the so-called Oriental person. They need to be ruled with a strong hand and so forth. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. I mean, that's the point. Orientalism is wrong. I'll probably talk about it more in like other situations as well. But yeah, we have the Agatean Empire, which has everyone being dirt poor, literally, while you have a few noble houses that live off the masses, exploit them to no end, kill them, or, treat them as less than human, basically, and have been doing so for a long, long time. And it's fairly clear that this is absolutely wrong and should not be the way it should be. It is. But as I said, this is like a classic idea of feudalism. Now, what we see afterwards is the rise, so to speak, of the Red Army, what he calls the Red Army, which is a group of rebels who want to change the system. And there's obviously problems in the way the Red Army is portrayed. It's also the idea is that it was set up by the evil mastermind to then use them once he has quashed the revolution, the rebellion, to use that to actually gain even more power and so forth. But apart from that, the idea is that they will overthrow the government and start to put in place basically what you might call communism. I'll just call it communism. The way it is described is like the People's Committee and so forth. He uses those catchphrases. And, well, that doesn't happen at the end of the day, but that's sort of the setup of this world. And if that feels very much like sort of a very, very boiled down, like, simplistic look at human, like world history, or at least like, Russian or Chinese history of, say, the 20th century mostly, then I feel that that's on purpose. Pratchett has always been someone who has taken real world events and experiences to put them in his books. Now, I don't have a problem per se with using these ideas and making political statements about them. I personally am not a huge fan of libertarianism, but that doesn't mean that I can't appreciate someone using a fantasy story to make these arguments. And yeah, the criticism of imperialism, or not imperialism, of feudalism, yeah, I'm 100% with Pratchett on that one. And the way that he argues that that communism, which is structured by these committees that then rules, decide what is good for everyone. Well, I mean, in the early 90s, that is basically what people in the West thought about, like why the Soviet Union failed, so to speak, right? That's part of that specific mindset, that specific early 90s mindset. The idea that committees decide through argument how people on the ground should do agriculture and all these other things. And that's a slightly faulty analysis, I would say. But there's certainly, arguments to be made that idea of how to build a country is maybe not 150% right. So yeah, I get that whole argument that he's trying to make here, because what it boils down to at the end is an argument about responsibility. Because Cohen the barbarian, who takes over the country at the end of the day, right? He's like, you know what? I'm not better than anyone else. He becomes emperor at the end of it all, but he's like, you know what? At least I take responsibility for my actions. I'll, charge with my soldiers. I'll do all of these things, which is where I guess the idea of this individualist and responsibility part of like a very positively tinted view of libertarianism comes in. Now, as I said, like that part is problematic on a political view, at least for me, but so basically that's the lesson we can take from this book on a political level is feudalism bad, socialism or communism organized in the Soviet way bad, individualism and capitalism good, because there's obviously always a contrast between Ankh-Morpork on the one hand and the Agatine Empire on the other hand. And this is sort of where we have us a bit of a problem. Let's talk about that. Now, the big problem here is obviously the racist stereotypes and whatnot. The Agatine Empire is a very, direct copy of what you might call Western views of ancient China and ancient Japan. It's a bit of a mix-up of those two, but it takes all those cliches and stereotypes and uses them to make jokes and whatnot, and portray that country. And Ankh-Morpork, of course, is something of a early modern. It's kind of hard to pin down where Ankh-Morpork is society-wise at every specific point of the Discworld time. But it's like somewhere between 17th century Enlightenment and Victorian age London and England. And if you code these things this directly, it becomes very much about like a political statement when you have the white sort of white. We'll talk about that specific aspect in a bit. But you have that this Western European culture is good because individualism, because capitalism and entrepreneurship and whatnot. And on the other hand, you have this Eastern coded, Asian coded, Orientalist coded part, which is bad because people suffer through all of that. Through those choices of bad systems and whatnot. It leaves a bit of a sour taste with me. But yeah, I think that's like one of the large problems on like a more like general level with this book. And then there's obviously, that part could have probably been saved if it would not have been set in the Agatine Empire, but in, some other part of the Discworld that is not as specifically coded after a specific continent or a specific country or a specific culture in our world. And obviously the next aspect is that Terry Pratchett as a writer is a white writer, a British writer from that specific culture, which makes these jokes more egregious. Like if a Chinese writer or a Japanese writer would have written the same book, it would have still felt weird, but differently weird, I guess. But, he's not, so here we are. So let's talk about those jokes. And that's like the problem, like, compared to a lot of the other Discworld novels where we deal with, like, racist stereotypes in a more enlightened way, a more aware way. Here's just like straight out cheap like Asian jokes, right? Problematic Asian jokes. Jokes about food, jokes about the language, jokes about really cheap sumo wrestler jokes on like, yeah, they're huge and fat. Let's treat them like they're stupid animals for a joke. I was like, dude, that just feels bad. And now I know this, once again, this is early 90s. A lot of stuff was like still acceptable, socially acceptable in the West in the early 90s, and it just really didn't age well. Was it like that bad yet back then? Yes. Were we all aware of it? Hell no, we probably not. And I'm 100% sure that, like, especially the sumo wrestler joke worked wonders in like the early 90s, and I'm pretty sure I would have laughed about it when I was like 14 or 15. I'm pretty sure. Now, and that's, I feel, compared to most other Discworld novels, this is the one that has aged the worst because of all these cultural aspects. The cultural insensitivity is just staggering in this one, and it's just even more staggering compared to other Pratchett books where, you know, he doesn't blunder that badly. He even doesn't blunder that badly in this book at the beginning, right? So let's look at that bit for a moment, right? So at the beginning, when Rincewind is still on this like tropical island somewhere, we have the weird Amazonian joke, which I guess is mostly Amazonian slash Wonder Woman slash whatever, forgotten lost world kind of joke. When Rincewind is accosted by this group of apparently extremely well-looking white blonde women who tell him that they are from this Amazonian tribe. All their menfolk has been killed by this by this very specific and short-lived plague, and they're looking for someone to help them carry on their race. I think they use the word race, but you know what I mean. Their population. And they were like, you may wonder why we are white and blonde, everyone around here is dark. I guess it's just one of those genetics things. And that shows that Pratchett is aware of how in these kind of fantasies we often just put in a very specific, fundamentally racist or like white-centric perspective. He's aware of all of that. And then he still goes for all these cheap Asian jokes. And I'm like, dude, why? Now, I guess part of that is the Rincewind problem, right? So Rincewind has always been a bit of a not problematic, but difficult character. I personally really like the first two Discworld novels, Color of Magic and Light Fantastic, because they are a bit more making fun of the fantasy genre, of the sword and sorcery genre, and so forth. And I'm a huge fan of those stories, so that's fun. But they are also much more coarse in their jokes, much more direct in their jokes. There's a lot of more like repetitive jokes and slapstick moments in there, because that's like the kind of way you have with the character Rincewind, who is basically this eternal coward. And I think that's the way to read Rincewind. He's not supposed to be a realistic character. He's more a commentary on how fantasy, specifically in like, older fantasy, pulp, short story fantasy, how characters behave there. And Rincewind is just the opposite of all of that. There's even like in a later one that specific comment that like there must be like if Rincewind is the eternal coward, there must be something like the eternal champion somewhere, right? There is, if you have to read Rincewind as a commentary on the fantasy literature, on not so much on the real world. Just the same as you have to read Cohen the Barbarian as such in a lot of ways. And after changing Discworld over the last couple of novels, in being Small Gods, Soul Music, Men at Arms, and so forth, into much more of a work that is looking at our world, looking at socio-political issues in our world, it feels a bit weird to come back to something like Rincewind that is more of a criticism of, or like, not a criticism, but like a reflection of, a caricature of specific tropes in fantasy or specific subgenres of fantasy literature. Feels a bit odd, and if you keep forget that aspect, it becomes even more egregious. Don't get me wrong, the Asian jokes are still horrible, and yeah. They don't get better. Now, what else is interesting? The Cohen plotline, because I feel I like the Cohen plotline a bit more than the Rincewind bits, mostly because a lot of that is interaction between the barbarian heroes and their barbarian teacher, Mr. Savaloy, who's trying to teach them the ways of civilization. And that works fairly well on several levels. Like, not all the time, but it works well. It has this more like Monty Python absurdist humor kind of thing when you have these barbarians who are all very, very old and have always lived like barbarians, trying to figure out civilized ways, trying to learn about economy, learn about society. And there's bits and pieces in there where it's like, yeah, that's called civilized. I'll take barbarism over that any time, because certain aspects of, well, civilization can also lead to, suffering and whatnot. And that awareness is there. It also just leads to wonderfully absurd jokes in there. And to put that barbarian heroes teacher relationship thing there, I think is mostly a commentary on, well, the 30s pulp stories like Conan the Barbarian, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, that stuff, which is mostly like young boys' power fantasies. And to treat those heroes, those characters basically, like mostly pre-adolescent or just adolescent boys who think with basically their dicks most of the time and are just plain idiots in a lot of ways, puts that facet on the table in a way that I personally appreciate. Plus, as I said, it's just funny, because I really like those really dumb jokes. I've always been a fan of really dumb jokes. So the fact that one of those barbarians always, every single time as a running gag, always laughs dirtily when someone uses the word social intercourse. Yeah. If you want to portray a bunch of barbarians like who have never learned anything in their life, if you want to portray them as 14-year-old kids, of course, when I was, 13-year or whatever, of course boys in that age would probably just laugh about that thing because they have just learned about sexuality. Know what I mean? So yeah, that bit works. The Rincewind part, I mean, it's a bit of a Rincewind problem in general that, since he's running away from everything and then just blundering into something new and so forth, as a tool of the gods mostly, leads to less interesting interactions. At least this time around, he gets a bunch of good, conversations, which I want to acknowledge there. For example, the conversation in the dungeons, and one earlier about how it is wrong to lay down your life for a cause. It's like, you can pick up a cause. You only have one life, but you can pick up a cause at every corner. It's like, yeah, there's reasons to that, especially if someone else tells you to lay down your life for something. Now, if you decide to do that, it's your decision, but never do these kinds of things because someone else tells you. That idea in there is, I feel like there's reasons to that, and that there's ways how that, is done properly. But a lot of it just like, running around and coming from one ridiculous situation to another one. There's very little in there apart from the slapstick jokes, and if those are like just like racist tinged in a way, then that just doesn't work well. But there's other like bits and pieces that I found were really good. the interaction with Rincewind and Two Flower, about Two Flower's past. We learned that Two Flower's wife was killed by, and we find out later on, by Lord Hong. It's one of those situations where Terry Pratchett shows once again that he is so good at dealing with like very like the nuances of human human interaction. Where it's like he never explicitly states these kind of things. And it's like, yeah, and like Two Flowers' face changed, so Rincewind had to turn away. And it's like the way he comes from like something really ridiculous to suddenly something super serious. Those bits are once again really good. He does a bunch of those in here as well. So there's good bits and pieces in here. Once again, another fun thing that got introduced in this book is, or not introduced, but like elaborated on, is obviously Hex. And I do love Hex, like the computer, the weird computer that the wizards in Ankh-Morpork have built, and the fact that they have a ram skull in there for occult transformations. There's a lot of dumb computer jokes in there that I personally find, fun, because I'm that kind of person. And those bits and pieces are really funny and work as just like dumb slapstick jokes. It's just the overall focusing on this one political argument, making it too directly a East-West, global East, global West kind of argument about capitalism, liberal capitalism versus both feudalism and communism, just doesn't work well with me. And choosing, collecting all these racist jokes about Chinese food and whatnot just didn't age well. Now we can ask ourselves, why did he choose that part and so forth? And there's definitely a reason there that, as I said, like at the early 90s, there is that feeling in the West that we have won and this is the best system and so forth. And the question, and then obviously, especially racism, anti-Asian feelings or anti-Asian sentiments and stereotypes have lingered much longer in media, or have been have been acceptable, socially acceptable, much longer than, say, anti-black stereotypes and jokes. There's probably like an argument behind that I don't feel I'm qualified to make, but it's certainly something that has, that needs to be acknowledged. So there's probably a reason why we go with the Asian jokes here. Then there's a bunch of just the usual Terry Pratchett jokes where he does really fun pop culture references in there, and he does those, and I'm obviously happy with them. But yeah, overall, it just feels a bit fallen out of its time. Terry Pratchett trying to recapture that older Discworld feel and kind of failing at it in a lot of ways. So, as I said, this is not a good Discworld novel. It's not my least favorite one, I think. But it's certainly the one that has aged the worst. It really has not aged well. And I think one argument why I think it's a good idea to read it nevertheless is exactly that argument, to look at how how an author who is overall fairly progressive and fairly aware of problems like racist, classist, and so forth problems, how someone like that, like Terry Pratchett, still manage to blunder this far. And probably why this was back in the day. This is like a 25-year-old book, 26-year-old book. And to look at how our perception has changed in the meantime. Apart from that, yeah, there's a bunch of good quotes, a bunch of good jokes in there, and I'm fine with all of those. But yeah, I'll probably not reread it very soon. There's other Rincewind books I personally prefer. And yeah, let me know what you think about this one. when you have last read it, if you liked it, if you have problems with it, and so forth. I'd love to hear your opinions. Like, subscribe, share, do all those wonderful things, and I'll see you around. Until then, cheers.